Okay, thank you everybody. Good morning and welcome, and thank you for joining today. My name is Damien Burley. I am the Chief Revenue and Marketing Officer for a company called Acuity Knowledge Services, as you see on the screen. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar entitled Tailwinds for Infrastructure Finance under the New Administration. We wanted to give the audience a little bit of insight and perspective in terms of infrastructure and what we see potentially unwinding during this year. We think it's very topical, we think it's well timed, and we hope that you enjoy this session. We're certainly going to try and make this very interactive. We're going to run this session for approximately an hour and with 15 minutes of Q&A. For those of you that haven't used Zoom previously, in the bottom central area, you'll be able to see Q&A and submit your questions, and the panelists will receive your questions through the presentation, and in addition, at the end, we'll prioritize questions as well. And if your question isn't answered today, we'll ensure that your question is answered following this session as well. We recognize that some of you may not know Acuity Knowledge Services, so I just wanted to explain why us and why we're hosting this today. We're a 19-year-old organization servicing the financial services market, both the banking and the asset management and private equity community. We also service corporates. And one of the reasons that we wanted to host this today is we believe that the infrastructure side of the marketplace, and particularly of what's going to be going on in the United States, is paramount to the investment community, both in terms of long-dated instruments they could invest in, but also the general rebuilding of infrastructure across the world is something that we think is of huge interest, so very topical from a US perspective. We have over 350 organizations that are blue chip that we service in the financial services markets. And today we've had a huge amount of organizations actually participate in this webinar. So we hope you enjoy it. And we've got a great panel. These are some of the people that have joined us today and registered for the seminar. So you can see a large range of banks, asset management, private equity, and corporate organizations as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a great person here, Thomas Morville, who's Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure at KeyBank. Truly great guy, and you'll see that as we go through this session. Tom has had a great amount of experience in project finance, and you'll see has helped in certain types of transactions through his career. Some of the notable ones were the City of San Marcos Public Services, the University of Iowa's Energy Concession, the FC Cincinnati West End Stadium, and the Columbus Crew Stadium, and the list goes on. So without further ado, Tom, please got a hand to you to introduce the panel and the subject. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Damien, and thanks to Acuity for hosting this webinar today. I'm very excited and happy to be here with you all, and happy to be part of be here with this esteemed panel. And thank you for that introduction. And I think a lot of folks do know our practice at Key, and our role typically in the market is one where we do serve as a financial advisor or lender, raising the debt capital for the private sector in these public-private partnerships where private investment is brought to public infrastructure. And so, as Damien said, we'd like to make sure this is really interactive. So please do, as your questions arise, we'll probably address them at the end, but don't be shy, and please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to submit those questions. But we'd really like to start off, I think, first asking our panelists just to do an introduction of themselves, and we'll start off with DJ. DJ, if you don't mind.
Not at all, Tom. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Damien. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you all this morning. So my name is DJ Griffin. I'm a founder of Madras, which is a strategic consulting firm that advises clients on how to implement infrastructure projects more efficiently. Background as a lawyer and a banker and head of strategic consulting for an engineering firm. So the goal is to try to pull everything together and have a holistic strategic view of large infrastructure projects. I'm also a senior operating partner at Stone Peak Infrastructure Partners, non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. So wear several hats, and I'm excited to be here today talking about infrastructure policy.
Great, thank you very much, DJ. Frank, would you go next, please?
Thanks, Tom. Hi, Frank Saker here. I'm the Interim Executive Director of Gateway Development Corporation. I've been with Gateway for about 3 years now. Joined as the Chief Financial Officer and graduated into this current role. Before that, I was a banker for 20 plus years, working in the infrastructure space in the United States, North America generally, and originally Australia. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be here.
Great, thank you very much, Frank. John?
Hi, John Dionisio. Yes, I also thank Tom and fellow panelists for giving me the opportunity to be on the panel. I also agree that Tom Mulvihill is a great guy, so I second that. Meridium, as many of you know, is a long-term infrastructure developer and investor. We've been around for 15 plus years and currently manage about $8 billion of institutional investor capital across 3 markets: North America, Europe, and Africa. Our focus is really in 3 sectors: in the mobility sector, roads, airports, rail, social infrastructure, and energy transition. Again, happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
That's great. Thank you, John. And thanks to all of you for your intros there. And Sid, if you don't mind, we'd like to bring up our first polling question. So we'd really like to get folks to, again, we want to make this interactive. We want to know who's out in the audience. We also want to make sure folks aren't multitasking. So we're going to have a couple of these throughout the webinar today. And so this one is, which of the following best describes your role in the market, from banking and asset management, pension funds, private equity? Are you in the public sector, government role? Are you with a not-for-profit or university or other? And so folks could take the time here to select a few of those. I see we've got about 126 people signed up. So hopefully everybody can take a few seconds here to click on the role that represents them.
And I can point out, in the spirit of making every vote count, that panelists and hosts, it tells me, are not allowed to vote. So,
I think that's right. All right, so we've got quite a few investment banks and advisory firms, PE, and a lot of other. I think a lot of people are not trying to disclose who they're with, but that's okay. All right, not a lot of government folks, but okay, very good. Well, thank you for that. All right, well, I'll just take a few minutes to set the stage, and then we're gonna go into some Q&A with each of the panelists, and then I think we'll have, I don't want to call it a free-for-all, but we'll have discussion amongst ourselves and open it up to Q&A at that point before turning it over to Damien. So I'll just start with the American Society of Civil Engineers, often quoted, but released a report in January stating that over the next 20 years, we're going to underinvest in our infrastructure to the tune of $5.6 trillion. So that is the funding gap, the underinvestment, and that number is based on the economy in 2019. So pre-COVID, and obviously with the economic contraction we saw with COVID, that number is likely only widened. In their report card, which they update every 4 years, and the next one's due out next month, but in their previous scorecard, they rated our infrastructure at D+. So not very good, and with the lack of investment that we're seeing here going forward, it's going to be hard to see that really improve significantly without new funding being made available. And the federal government plays an important role, a critical role, in providing that funding of infrastructure. And so some of the key programs that we'll maybe touch on in our discussion today, one is the Fixing America's Surface Transportation, or FAST Act, also often referred to as the Highway Trust Fund. It's usually a multi-year piece of legislation that expired last year. It was extended for a single year. Hopefully under the new administration, we can get a new multi-year bill approved. It relies heavily on state, a lot relies heavily on gas taxes and diesel taxes as a source of funding for roads and rail. And not only has it been really just an insufficient funding source, it's been one that's really been in decline as we drive less, as we use more efficient vehicles, and as we transition to electronic vehicles. The fundamental source of funding there is inadequate, and just the sheer amount of it is not enough. And so we need a fix there for sure. And the trust fund itself relies on appropriations from the general fund to subsidize it. So there's really a crucial need here to have new funding made available to stabilize the Transportation Trust Fund. One of the other big funding programs is the better utilizing investments to leverage development, or the BUILD discretionary grant program. This replaced what was previously referred to as the Tiger grant program. It provides discretionary grants to a variety of projects, and it's really up to that administration to decide which projects get the funding. And since 2009, about $9 billion of funding has been made available, which sounds like a great big number, but frankly, over 12 years, it's really not a huge number. And the nature of it, discretionary grants are great, discretionary grants. The challenge I see with them is it just doesn't provide the public sector with the ability to do the long-term planning that they need. And whether or not by the time they're ready to ask for a grant, the administration that is then in charge is going to prioritize their project above others and fund it. So again, funding's great. We need more of it, but maybe the way in which we go about funding it might change a little bit. So President Biden's Build Back Better program is a $2 trillion number for clean tech and infrastructure. And I think we all thought the prior administration's $1 trillion number was a huge one, at least to talk about. So now we've got $2 trillion to talk about. And I think we've heard that really a lot from many administrations in the past is, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure. There tends to be a lot of bipartisan support for infrastructure, but we just don't get the big, we haven't seen a big bipartisan deal materialize yet. So we're hopeful that maybe this is the time that it happens. In fact, DJ Griffin recently authored an article for the Brookings Institute on this topic, and we'll hear from DJ shortly on that. And just wrap up here in my comments before jumping over to some specific questions for John. But as part of today's discussion, we'll touch on how the Biden plan might impact private investment into public infrastructure. We'll talk about how the Biden tax plan could impact infrastructure investments and infrastructure development. We'll touch on a few of the key sectors that can benefit, that are going to be a core focus for the Build Back Better plan. And finally, we'll touch on what's been the impact of COVID on infrastructure projects and public-private partnerships. So a lot of good topics to talk about, and hopefully we'll get, again, some good questions from the audience here. And so John, maybe leading off with you, as an infrastructure investor, where do you see the private sector investors bringing the most value to public infrastructure, and which sectors are really best suited for P3s?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And I encourage fellow panelists and attendees to chime in with questions, but maybe just a remark based on what you said, Tom. You led off talking about how the US has a $5.6 trillion infrastructure deficit, and the American Society of Civil Engineers rated the US infrastructure at D+. It's clearly remarkable. I think it's also remarkable that for as long as I'm sure everyone on this panel and everyone on this webinar has been in the industry, the grade hasn't really changed that much. It's been the headline for at least 2 decades, which I think points certainly to the complexity of the problem, and also potentially the fact that federal governments haven't necessarily supported initiatives in a way that could meaningfully improve that. And I look forward to getting into that topic or this conversation. The question was, where do we see private investors bringing value into which sectors? maybe I'll take a step back and quickly frame what the value the private sector brings, just to maybe set the stage. In my mind, and this is coming off of a year where we've seen some great projects close. We've also, as an industry, and Meridian specifically, have been involved in some challenging projects, some projects that didn't necessarily go as planned. And when I was thinking about what the private sector brought, the usual things come to mind. It's clearly financing innovation. It's the ability to innovate technically. It's the ability to provide innovation through competition and accept long-term risk that the public sector wouldn't otherwise accept. But I think what we've learned in the last, let's say, 18, 24 months is it doesn't work without a public sector who's willing to be a partner. What we expect, and when it works well, the public sector is a strong partner, not only providing procurement rigor, but also accepting some of the risks that the private sector just is not well equipped to handle. And some of those risks we've seen materialize include environmental risk, utility risk, right-of-way risk. And so my hope in terms of the value the private sector bring could be looked at in the context of what both a partnership with the private sector and the public sector can bring collectively. And I also want to mention something that I learned recently. A good friend of mine, Dan Stoppenhagen, now at Lane, clued me in on a project that he'd worked on with the University of Texas, which was effectively to try to look at the typical design build contract and figure out what worked well and what didn't work well. And if anyone hasn't read it, I would go to the TxDOT website because it actually, I think, sets the stage for what should be balanced risk transfer in this market, talking about right-of-way risk, utility risk, et cetera. So, and hopefully with the adoption of that in other places, this value the private sector could bring will result in projects that are being completed as intended, on time and on budget. With respect to sectors, and I hope DJ talks about this, I'm sure he will, it's no doubt that the federal government has shifted its focus to climate initiatives, electric vehicles, climate resiliency, transit. From our perspective, we are spending a lot of time in new sectors. 2020 was a year where we saw biogas become an interesting investment sector. We've participated in district energy projects with municipalities and universities. We've supported broadband initiatives. And of course, I think it's our hope, and I think also the administration's hope, that the infrastructure system won't function without a really strong base. And when I think of base, I think of transit, road, and social infrastructure. So that's the focal point that I think the industry, especially Meridian, is focused on at this point in time, Tom.
Great. Thank you, John. That's a very helpful insight, and appreciate that. You know, one of the other challenges we see often with U.S. infrastructure is just the long lead time and how much planning goes into projects. And it seems like there's endless planning. And, you know, we spend more time planning projects than actually building them. And so you know, how do you see P3s and private sector, you know, input and innovation accelerating infrastructure projects?
Yeah, well, you know, going back again, as long as we've been talking about the U.S. infrastructure report card, we've been talking about the need for governments and procuring authorities, universities, to lay the groundwork to enable these projects. So support these efforts with the technical experts at either WSP or you know, HDR, HMTB, all the consultancies that have done a great job in formulating the right plans to get private investors involved, in addition to hiring the right financial advisors. So that's imperative, as it always has been. I think interestingly, what we've been seeing in the P3 market maybe it's because some of the projects didn't necessarily go the way they were planned. Maybe it's because the complexity of the projects is increasing. We're seeing P3 models also in transition. We certainly support the traditional way of procuring fixed projects with 3 to 4 teams, resulting in firm fixed price bidding. But we're also seeing the advent of new procurement models, the project development agreement that we've been involved in. Some of our fellow participants in the market, like Plenary, have been involved in. And this is an interesting dynamic because, to your point, it allows the private sector to get involved early to really partner with the government and move the critical pieces along in a way that theoretically does not impact the public sector's ability to prove that the major elements of the project are subject to competition. And I think that part of the how, we talked about what the private sector brings, but how they bring it, I think it's important that procuring authorities look at that model and ask themselves seriously if it is if because the infrastructure at hand is complicated, it requires a lot of lead time and work, if it's the right way to do it. I think it's encouraging for many sectors and projects.
I think that's right. We certainly are seeing, the evolution of more PDA style transactions, or progressive P3s is the other term I've heard more and more in the market, and right, bringing that private partner in early and using their global experience to help shape that local solution for sure. So thank you for that. And maybe the last one at this point for you, John, is, as the lead developer on the LaGuardia Central Terminal building P3, how did COVID-19 impact construction, and what's kind of the view in your mind on what the timing is for employments to return to pre-COVID levels?
Yeah, well, we've spent a lot of time early in this year assessing the portfolio and asking ourselves how COVID would impact projects. I think we saw probably more of a correlation with respect to schedule improvements on road projects. Unfortunately, less people are traveling, which led to less maintenance of traffic issues, which allowed construction companies to advance projects more expediently. On LaGuardia, the plan always was to deliver that project while the airport was operating fully. So I don't necessarily think that there was a massive construction schedule benefit. I do think some of the early impacts of COVID with respect to quarantine rules on LaGuardia specifically, unfortunately, some of the construction crew fell ill to COVID. And I have to give a kudos to Skanska and Walsh for adapting to the challenges during construction. I don't think there was necessarily a correlation to COVID and making construction easier. We opened up the head house fully in the fall, clearly with less activity. And with respect to the employments, I still have the good fortune of working for Jane Garvey and being able to defer all complicated questions to her on that regard. Not quite
Fair
sure.
enough. Fair enough. So I don't know. I can appreciate that. I can say from our perspective on the projects that we've lent into that are under construction, I think similar experience that, actually it was, in a way they had an easier ability to accelerate as long as the logistics. So, we were able to get parts and equipment, the folks could generally operate during COVID very well. And we didn't see any real delays in projects as a result of COVID. So it's really been a pretty minimal impact on our side from a construction standpoint. And I'll just say personally, I think I could see potential for employments coming back very strong pre-COVID. I think everybody's tired of being at home and they want to get down to the Caribbean or get anywhere else but here, wherever here is. So I think we'll see a strong rebound, but that's just me speaking, and I can appreciate the complexity of that question. So thank you, John, for all that. And maybe before we get over to DJ, Sid, if you wouldn't mind putting up the next polling question So folks, we are again hoping to get some insight from you to help guide this discussion and make it as interesting for you as it can be. So the more info you give us, the more we can kind of tailor our remarks. And so where do you see the immediate need for or large funding gaps in U.S. infrastructure investments? And that's for public and private infrastructure spending. So you can click a few boxes here. Maybe the simple way to say this is, where do you see the biggest needs in our infrastructure, and where should more funding be dedicated? So we'll leave it there for a minute or half a minute and see how folks respond. And to your point, Frank, earlier, you're right. The host can't answer, so we can't skew the discussions. All right, Sid, what do we got? All right, so it looks like roads and crossings lead the way. So 45% of folks are seeing that as a big place for investment, followed by energy. I think to your point, John, earlier, renewables and rail, right? So that's great. We're hearing a lot on broadband. I think especially rural broadband is getting a lot more talk these days. And I know that's not necessarily our focus here today, but that's quite a bit of activity we're seeing there. So, but as you can see, it's across all the sectors pretty evenly. And I think that just shows that our infrastructure is not in great shape, and there's a lot we need to do. So, okay, thank you, Sid. So DJ, having served in the White House as an advisor to the president on infrastructure, what do you envision will be some of the major challenges the new administration will face in passing major new infrastructure legislation?
Tom, great question. And thanks again for having me. I enjoyed listening to John's remarks. I also like this interactive poll thing you've got going. I've not seen that before, and it's a good way to draw people in. So, so in terms of what we're likely to see in infrastructure, let me just start by breaking out a little bit. When we talk about infrastructure, one of the persistent themes in infrastructure policy is, what do you mean by infrastructure, right? Because people come to this debate with different points of view in terms of what infrastructure is. And so if we're talking specifically about funding, which is where I'll start, there are three different paths forward from here, right? We could have COVID spending, which we've seen a little bit already, but it's really been focused primarily on operations. So airlines receive funding, railroads, Amtrak, transit. That funding really is focused on just trying to make sure the system that we had going pre-pandemic is there when we need it, when this pandemic is over. Secondly is a highway bill. And so I know you categorize each of these in terms of likelihood of success. Highly, highly, highly probable that we have COVID funding for infrastructure in some form. Next, Tom, as you mentioned in your remarks, we extended the Highway Reauthorization Act to the end of this fiscal year, which is September 30th. So at that sometime between now and then, we're going to have to reauthorize that program, hopefully for several years, find funding sources. Probability of that happening very high as well. It's an ongoing program. It spends money in pretty much every community in America. Very, very popular. And there's been talk of bringing earmarks back, which will make that bill even more attractive to members of Congress. Okay. Then finally, when you think about overall infrastructure, right? So the type of approach that we took in the White House was we want to move beyond this 1950s focus on highways and allow communities to identify their priorities, whether that be water, whether it be broadband, whether it be highways, transit, kind of what your community's interests are, and allow you to spend on those priorities. So very broad, very big package. That problem with that type of package is twofold. There are systemic challenges to that approach, and there's some policy challenges to that approach. So let me start with the systemic challenges. One is our system. I think as people on this call are aware, the U.S. political system, our legislative system, is designed to not change the status quo, right? You have majorities of both houses, you have separation of three different branches of government. So our system is designed just to be very difficult to move things through it. So you're always facing a bit of a headwind. I tell people, if someone asks you, will this bill pass or not, always vote no, just bet on no. Because 9 times out of 10, unfortunately, you're going to be accurate. If you just say no, it's unlikely to pass. So that is a bit of a challenge. And then just the logistics of getting a broad bill through Congress. So the way that we drafted our legislation, it would have gone through 9 different congressional committees, right? Because you have all types of infrastructure represented, and so every committee needs to align on that. And so that's just hard, and obviously this White House is going to face exactly that same logistical challenge. So 2 systemic challenges: the system itself and the committee structure. In terms of policy challenges, the biggest one is just meeting expectations. I was amazed at how many people thought that if the federal government funds this, this will be kind of free funds, and I can get more from the federal government than I would get otherwise, which on a community by community basis is rational, but holistically, but there is no federal funding source that's not coming from a state and local taxpayer, right? But there is this Lake Wobegon-ish, everyone can be above average sense of federal funding for infrastructure. And so you're going into an expectation environment in which everyone thinks they can get more out than they are currently without putting any more in. And so that's a significant hurdle. I had a fascinating meeting with a group of mayors, and I explained this dynamic. Like, federal government can move money from one place to another. It can borrow from future generations, but it can't have everyone get out more than they put in. And I asked the mayors, we were sitting around the Tailwinds Indian Treaty Room in the White House, asked the mayors, how many people here would like to have more federal funding? And every hand went up. Say, okay, well, to do that, we need to take funds to give you more, we need to take it from someone else. So who here would like to invest more in another community's infrastructure? And not surprisingly, no hands went up on that offer. So it's almost like we're at this big family dinner and everyone's sitting around waiting to see if mom and dad are going to pick up the check at the end of the dinner, right? So all the kids around there, we're all kind of waiting. Some kids just like, forget this, I need to get going, I got other things going on, I'll ask for a separate check and get out of here. And we've had 30 plus states that have raised the gas tax since the federal government has. So that sort of policy dynamic is really hard when you're trying to meet expectations and get people excited about this bill. The other policy challenge is the top priority by US DOT, and this fits in the expectations bucket. The top 3 priorities are climate change, equity, and jobs, right? All like totally legitimate policy goals. But note, and this is for the US Department of Transportation, but note what's not on that list is mobility or safety. So already we're starting the debate with a little discordance between what people are likely to expect from the Department of Transportation and the policy challenge they hit on. And then the final challenge they're going to have in this bill. And John touched on it earlier, and yes, I will raise climate change. Because man, is it hard to get a big infrastructure package through. Like it is really, really, really hard. And I've written on this, and you can go to the Brookings website and see why I think it's hard, but it's just really hard. Any legislation is hard, but infrastructure is really hard. If you complicate infrastructure with an issue like climate change, where there's not an accepted fix to climate change, right? There's still debate over what we should be doing around it. So not only are you trying to solve infrastructure problems, but you're trying to solve climate change problems, that becomes a challenge. And I'm not saying, don't do that. It's not a worthy goal. I'm just saying, if you're looking towards what is the Biden administration, the tailwinds are public wants better infrastructure, public's willing to accept more deficit spending, so funding should be a little bit easier. They're building off the lack of success in the last administration, so politically it's a way to differentiate yourself. So good tailwinds there. The headwinds are the systemic, how is the system structured, and some of these policy positions they've taken where they're going to put more baggage into an infrastructure program than it would typically have, and that may make it so heavy that it's hard to lift across the finish line.
Great, yeah, thank you. A lot of good points in there. And I'll say, as a parent of teenagers, I greatly appreciated the picking up a check at dinner comment. I thought that was pretty good. I think one thing, I know you spent a lot of time working on issues around regulatory changes, and maybe this gets more onto the policy point, but how do you see regulatory changes coming out of this administration, and does that help or hinder further infrastructure investment?
I think regulatory changes, that is the most impactful thing the administration can do. Because as I mentioned before, like Congress, really hard to get into Congress. But as the president's demonstrated already, through the use of executive orders, through the use of regulatory changes, through just the use of policy, right? The administration can make considerable progress. So the four levers any White House has are statutory changes, regulatory changes, policy changes, and probably most impactful and most interesting, cultural changes, right? Just getting the government to be more responsive to certain things, and then contrarily, maybe less responsive to other things. So on the regulatory side, it's a little bit of a mixed message we have currently. On the one hand, both the president and the Secretary of Transportation have been very clear that they would like projects to move forward quicker than they have in the past. John mentioned this. It's since the Reagan administration, we've been trying to expedite the NEPA process, right, with limited degrees of success. But it's a perennial bipartisan Obama administration, Trump administration, like literally everyone is focused on trying to make this process better. The challenge is to do that raises concerns that you're shortcutting the environmental process. And I think early signals out of this administration, the big picture goal, good. Some specific actions, a little worrisome. Two that I'll mention. One is we had an executive order called One Federal Decision, which essentially required all the agencies. So behind me, there's a chart of the permitting process, right? You got half a dozen agencies, 29 statutes, 5 executive orders. Can take a decade to get hammer through this thing. I'm sure most people on this call has lived this some one way or another. But part of the challenge is these agencies don't work well together. They can be a little turf conscious. Sometimes the law requires you to ask the same agency, 2 different agencies, the same question. So that's never helpful. So what we did essentially said is, listen, right now it's like the soccer game where everyone's calling their own fouls. That's not working particularly well. We're going to put a referee on the field. We're going to force people to play according to the rules. And if you don't, we're going to give the ref the ability to penalize you. In this case, the ref was the Office of Management and Budget, right? So we structured all that, bipartisan support. Mayors loved it, governors loved it. First day of this administration, they repealed it. And my hope is what happened is they just did Trump EO environment search and then just deleted all of that, right? So I'm hoping it just got swept up into a bigger, my gosh, we certainly don't want to be like the Trump administration when it comes to environmental policy. The second one is obviously the Keystone Pipeline canceling that permit. It's, as I think everyone on this call can relate, it is really hard to get a project done in this country. You've got lots of challenges, lots of issues. For the federal government to essentially retroactively remove a permit is not a good look going forward.
Yeah, no, that's very fair, and it ups the risk for the private sector investors. Obviously, they're going to be putting money in at risk to deliver a project, thinking they've got their permits in hand, and then it gets pulled away. So yeah, I think there will be long-standing ramifications from that for sure. And maybe one last question for you before we go over to Frank. As I think through 4 years ago, we were talking about tax credits and for infrastructure and asset monetization and those types of terms and thoughts. How do you see this in this administration, other than you mentioned deficit funding, obviously, so just going to the well of the Treasury market, but what other nuances maybe that we haven't touched on yet that you see that are different with this administration versus the prior?
Oh, so the big one, John's called out already, so you kind of stole my thunder on that. But the big one's climate change, right? Climate change. It's the most absolutely fascinating thing that's going to happen in the course of this administration is how they manage the transition from hydrocarbons to renewables, right? Because this is not a tweaking of the current environment or a slight modification. They're looking for a wholesale change in the way this country generates, transmits, distributes power, right? So I think they've asked for a zero emission power system by 2035 and economy-wide zero carbon by 2050. So those are big, aggressive goals. The good news is that they have a number of tools available to them. They have tax credits, grants, low-income loans, CAFE standards. So this is a amazingly nuanced policy question. They also have potentially new tools, which would be a federal clean energy standard, the renewable portfolio standard, but on the federal side. They could, economists' favorite choice is just have a carbon tax, right? So if I were tracking this administration infrastructure policy, I think most of the really interesting moves are going to be on the energy side, and how do they move us from where we are now to where we want to go, using all the carrots and sticks that are available. And again, one of the sticks is the canceling of the Keystone XL pipeline. That also could be a cultural change of, hey, as the Biden administration, we're gonna double, triple think the wisdom of these hydrocarbon-centric projects, and that could have market-changing impacts.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, we'll transition to Frank, and again, Frank's the executive director of the Gateway Development Corp, a major mega monster, I don't know how to call it, infrastructure project in New York. And Sid, if you wouldn't mind putting up some slides to outline, and Frank will ask you to touch on these to outline the project, sure, the context, and then we'll jump into a few questions.
Oh, thank you very much. And monsters are fair comment. Some of the days that I'm working on this, that's for sure. We thought that it would be good just off the bat to spend a minute or two on a couple of slides, just refreshing on what the project, what the Gateway program is, and what the particular projects that we're focused on right now are. Just given we've not had too much to talk about over the last year or so. So clearly we are quite active at the moment, and we think we're going to become more active as the year transpires. So very briefly, Gateway program. It's a collection of projects aimed at reliability, resiliency, and redundancy in the Northeast corridor between New Jersey and New York. It's a line that has suffered, I think, from certainly investment over time, but also Hurricane Sandy over in 2012 accelerated a lot of the degradation and increased the urgency of the project. You'll see a photo there in the bottom right of inside the North River Tunnel itself. When you see it up close, it does look 110 plus years old. I can certainly vouch for that. That said, it's as busy as it's ever been, and including continue to run trains through it during these COVID times. So over 400 trains a day, a couple 100,000 people a day pre-COVID were utilizing the tubes. It is two tracks under the Hudson River, so it is a natural bottleneck in the system. And if you close a tube, as they do most weekends and weeknights for work, then that does constrain the capacity that can travel under the Hudson River between Penn Station, New York, and points south on the northeast corridor. It's clearly a central part of the economic engine of the region, and frankly, the nation. And I think it's identified by certainly all of our supporters on both sides of the river and in DC as one of the major projects in the country that needs to get done. I might ask you to move to the next slide, please, Sid. Thank you. So what we have here is certainly a simplified diagram that lays out the program itself. The items in green, if you like, where we are very active right now, sort of what we call phase one of the program. and in white phase 2, although I'll give a call out there as I see it to Penn Station expansion. Clearly that is becoming very active very quickly, and we're very, very encouraged by the work being done there. Refer to Portal North Bridge, which is the most advanced stage of the most advanced project in the program, being undertaken by our colleagues at New Jersey Transit. They actually got their federal grant approved in early January, and they are actually out in procurement right now. I think there's a invitation to bid RFQ stage for a design bid build on that project. It's a 100% designed project, and they're looking to move that one forward quite rapidly with a combination of federal and local funding from New Jersey as well. The Hudson Tunnel project, which I'll spend more time on in a second. So that is the construction of 2 new tracks under the Hudson River, and then the rehabilitation of the two existing tracks in the North River Tunnel. That is we're at about 30% design on the new tunnel construction, so a good jumping off point for launching into procurement, and certainly where we're spending a lot of our time at the moment. We call out the Hudson Yards concrete casing, which is a right-of-way project, preserving the right-of-way through the western Hudson Yards, which we think of in conjunction with the Hudson Tunnel project. Clearly, we need that to make sure that we can get our tracks into Penn Station. So that's the overall sketch of the program. If you go to the next slide, please, Sid. You'll see that this is actually a diagram of a map, excuse me, of the actual tunnel itself, and so the white line is the existing North River Tunnel, built in 1910 by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and now owned by Amtrak, starting there in Secaucus. And so basically Newark is at your very bottom left if you kept going off your screen, and continuing underneath New Jersey, basically North Weehawken, Southern Union City, under the Hudson River and into the Penn Station. For the new project in orange, the idea is to follow the same or very similar right-of-way in New Jersey, northeast out of Secaucus, and actually go underground in North Bergen, New Jersey, basically about 200 feet south of the existing portal. And that then continue on underneath Weehawken and Hoboken, and through really that under that New Jersey side, mainly through rock, and about 150 feet depth under the Palisades. Then continuing under the Hudson River, actually relatively shallow to the riverbed, and underneath, coming up at 12th, with another shaft at 12th Avenue and 30th Street, and on underneath the Hudson Yards and into the Penn Station complex. So that entire orange line is roughly about 4.5 miles, and so it's we're contemplating, and we'll talk about it a little more, perhaps breaking the project up into some segments. But overall, it is obviously a huge civil works project that will require huge amounts of labor and resources, and as well as being necessary, is also obviously a big stimulus opportunity for the country.
For sure.
Thank you for this, giving me the opportunity to put the slides up.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Frank, for that overview. That's great. And maybe if you could just briefly just give folks an idea of the governance structure of GDC, and who the main parties are that are decision makers.
Yes, and that's something we're working on right now, actually. And so I mentioned before, I'm currently part of the Gateway Development Corporation. We're in the process of moving across to literally and well, figuratively, I'm not sure literally yet. I don't seem to leave this room terribly much to the Gateway Development Commission. The commission is going to be a bi-state authority. We have enabling legislation that's being passed by the state of New York and the state of New Jersey, and our board includes representatives from the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, and Amtrak. And so our governance arrangements are really one, they're encased in enshrined in our legislation. We are in the process of getting ready to have the necessary governing arrangements inside GDC to enable the commission to start being active. And enabling us to really fulfill the role that's anticipated for GDC in terms of progressing the development and delivery of the project.
That's great. Yeah, and on some of the prior discussions, obviously we talked a bit about NEPA and environmental regulation. And can you provide a little update as to where where the project is at this point, or which elements of the projects? I'm sure it's not it's a complicated story, but.
Well, it's Gateway, so it is complicated. That's okay.
Right, makes it fun.
But we actually have for different parts of the project, we're at different stages in the environmental process. But for the Hudson Tunnel project itself, we have, if you remember back on my slides, I had the concrete casing. So that's approved from an environmental perspective. With regard to the body of the bulk of the Hudson Tunnel project itself, so the construction of the new project, rehabilitation of the existing tunnel, we're going through our process on environmental right now. Clearly, and it was in the public domain, we stalled for quite a while. We're certainly actively in dialogue with our federal colleagues on progressing our environmental approvals. And encouraged by the engagement and the support that we're seeing there, and so I'm not going to jinx anything by putting timelines on anything, but certainly there's a lot of momentum for the project at the moment.
Oh, that's for sure, and we know President Biden's been a long-standing supporter of Amtrak, and there's been some recent activity, I think, that helps Gateway find more funding for the project, and I guess to the extent obviously, and all that's still being worked through, but to the extent funding is starting to be made available over and it's something that can really start to allow the project to move forward. What are some of the next pieces that might move forward, and do you see any of them coming forward as P3s in any way?
Mm-hmm. So look, there's a lot to do. And as you can imagine, we haven't been sitting on our hands for the last however long year or so, waiting for any what the political changes have been. So we've been busy preparing the project to get ready for ultimately for procurement. Obviously, to do that, you asked a great question. The environmental process is a key critical path item for us in terms of advancing the project, both in terms of advancing the funding and financing side, which I will come to, but also importantly, we focus on this as and you'll be disappointed if I don't mention it at least once, in terms of risk. Very focused on the risks of the project, how we're and John mentioned it earlier in terms of how those risks are being allocated between owner and the private sector. We spent a lot of time on that analysis. That's part of what's informing the way that we're looking to advance on the project. But with that environmental process, that also enables us to sort of move forward on our funding and financing approach. And in terms of with the new administration, again, public record that we put in a submission for a federal grant back in August of 2020. We'll expect feedback on that in the next month or so, under the federal process, president's budget as it emerges. We're not sure exactly how that's going to play out yet, but clearly the dynamic is positive, and we have getting the ROD, getting the financial plan on the federal partner side, and in the next breath, very importantly, on the private, on the state local side is going to be very important for us. So we have commitments of currently of $5.55 billion from state of New York, state of New Jersey, and the Port Authority. I think bringing those and reaffirming those commitments and utilizing those as part of our funding and financing package is going to be very, very important. Where I was going with the risk topic that I was mentioning before is that in turn is going to inform the types of procurements and the types of involvement of the different partners that we see. Again, I hark back to what John said at the top of the call regarding risk allocation, and that you allocate risk needs to be allocated to the parties best able to manage those risks. And again, it's very much a truism in project finance, but it's definitely true in our project. We've got all the ones that John mentioned. We're there, right of way, utilities. I can throw in geotech. We've got plenty to go around, and so we're thinking very carefully about the best way to allocate those risks to make sure that we're getting. Again, I think this on my staff's bingo card. How are we going to get the best value for the project overall, and so that's going to drive us and drive our decisions in terms of procurement timing and methods.
Great. Well, before we're going to do a polling question in 1 second, I got one more quick one for you, and Frank, and then there's a lot of audience questions. We want to get to those, and please keep submitting those. But maybe we'll ask the question to Frank. We'll do a polling question real quick, and then actually I might want to ask the other panelists if they've got questions for any of the others, and then we'll hit the audience Q&A. And so Frank, obviously mega, as I started, mega monster, big, huge infra project. At this stage, what's kind of the public, the number available publicly for the scope of the project and some of the big chunks of it, just for those in the audience that aren't as familiar.
I should mention that for context. So right now in our financial plan, we have a cost estimate that is assuming $11.6 billion overall, which is $9.8 billion for the construction of the new tunnel and $1.8 billion for the rehabilitation of the existing tunnel. We've spent a lot of time and continue to spend a lot of time amongst the stakeholders and with our advisors about the right way to package the project to make sure that frankly the balance and getting the right balance between the number of packages, because something that you see in we certainly see in terms of mega projects generally, I think people in the panel and on the call will see interface risk is another key issue in mega projects, particularly mega project rail projects, and particularly mega project rail projects with tunnels. And so getting that interface risk right is very important to us. But we want to make sure that our packages aren't so big that we're frankly stifling competition in the market. And so they've got to be in sizes that will the market will be able to contemplate. And so we have those balances between the two, and that's going to drive our packaging and our procurement solutions.
Great, thank you, Frank. So Sid, if you wouldn't mind, if you could put up that polling question for us. It's our last polling question, and get folks' views on what do you see as the most likely new source of funding for infrastructure projects? Is it an increase in the federal gas tax? Do we institute a vehicle miles traveled tax? Is it more state and local sources, whether it's gas or sales taxes or other excise taxes, or more reliance on user fees and tolls? So which do folks think is the most likely new source of funding for infrastructure projects? So I'd love to get folks' views on that. Then once we get the results here, again, I'll open it up to the panelists just to see if there's any either additional quick comments or questions for each other, and then we'll start maybe addressing some of the audience questions. Okay, so user fee tolls gets the highest percentage vote here, along with an increase in the federal gas tax. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, certainly the gas tax is a quick and easy way, I think, to start to provide some new funding, because we've got all the mechanisms in place to do that. It's just increasing the rate, but that's also easier said than done at times. Okay, well, thank you for that. Again, I'll open it up to the panelists and see if they've got any comments or questions they want to share at this time.
Hey, Tom, I had a question that it looks like Frank Rappaport also asked, and I wanted to direct it to DJ, who a few years ago, DJ, you gave a keynote at one of the events we held, and you talked about OMB scoring. And we've always talked about that as an industry, unlocking or potentially correcting some of the imperfections of the scoring could lead to federal P3s. When you were in the federal government, did you look at it? What's your sense on appetite, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea? Your views would be helpful.
John, that's a great question. So yes, we absolutely did look at it. And just by way of background for people who are not following this issue, OMB has a circular A11 that has an appendix B. It was issued actually by Jack Lew when he was at OMB before being Treasury Secretary. And what that document essentially says is that if the federal government leases a facility and has any prepayment, any sort of right to buy at the end of that lease term, the entire value of that asset is scored in year one, right? So in other words, if you had a building and you said, all right, we the federal government, I'll take the USDOT building, which is USDOT is currently leasing, right? We're going to lease it from a private, but what we want as part of our lease agreement, which like literally anyone on this call would ask for if available. But at the end of the lease term, we'd like a purchase option for X dollars. If you include that purchase option in there, the entire value it's actually deemed a sale, not a lease, and the entire value of that asset is scored in the first year. So what happens? USDOT, a cabinet level agency that will not move buildings in our lifetime, right, is now paying annual rent on this building. So there are some policy benefits to doing that, and that is there was some misuse of leases early in the days where I think the Navy leased a warship, which clearly is not, clearly they're incurring a liability that goes beyond this year lease. And so we did work on two paths, John. One was changing the rules to look at if this truly is a private entity. In other words, if it's an FBI lab, that's probably not a lease because you got a lot of stuff in there that no one else but the FBI is going to need. If it's a office building like the USDOT, that absolutely ought to be able to be leased for purchase because again, the private sector can go out and sell that on the market at fair value. So what OMB is trying to avoid is a misscoring of liabilities being incurred by US taxpayers. So that was one solution. The other solution, which was in the administration's proposal, create a $10 billion revolving fund, count it, score it as a sale, and then just let the lease proceeds repay it. So from a federal budgeting standpoint, it's on the books as a full liability, but from the agency standpoint, they can do annual payments over time. So there are a couple of good solutions to that, but it's been, I just have to say, for anyone who wants to wade into this, this is almost like a religious issue with OMB. It was the toughest issue. I dealt with them the entire time I was in the White House.
It is a huge challenge. That's right. It really does kind of limit the ability to do, availability payment style P3s at the federal level, and it's very challenging. And appreciate all the hard effort you've put into trying to advance thinking there, DJ, for sure. I don't know if there's other questions that have been submitted that the panelists would like to hit up first. I don't need to be the one that necessarily decides that, but if there are others out there.
I just noticed Bill Hansen chimed in on, hey, we didn't mention waterways. One thing I love about infrastructure is we all kind of have our asset classes we prefer. And so there's always a bit of a challenge of trying to include everybody in the family when we talk about it. But waterways is somewhat unique in that they really are federally owned. Unlike all other infrastructure, which is primarily state and local owned, waterways for the most part are federal. And so I do think as part of this infrastructure package, it would be helpful for the federal government to say, first step, we're going to clean up our own house. We're going to take care of all of our backlog maintenance, and we're going to improve these facilities. And that could be something that could be done through a P3. Let's do that as a bit of an example to state and local governments of how to use innovative contracting and creativity to deliver more value.
Great. I see there's one here from Claudio. First question in is, with the U.S. now signing on to the Paris Accord and many key infrastructure funds prioritizing ESG concerns, how do we connect P3s and their ability to achieve long-term performance outcomes with these initiatives? And so I don't know, John, I don't know if you've had any thoughts about how, incorporating some ESG concerns into, performance the private sector might take in a P3. I've seen some social impact bond transactions, which try to look at, the performance of, ESG concerns and that being a result as to how investors get their return. I think that's what part of the question is getting at, unless I'm misunderstanding it. But I don't know if you've got any specific views on this question.
No, it's a great question, and certainly pinpoints one of the issues which you have to start thinking about these assets from a long-term perspective. We're working on something now, which, with the help of KeyBank, will hopefully provide a tool to link some of the long-term ESG performance elements of social infrastructure projects with actually financial ramifications, if not met, which we'll hopefully be able to announce towards the end of this week, Claudio. But I would look at some of the recent projects. I thought Fresno State did a really great job of balancing what typically is, a cost-focused procurement model with a model that focused on long-term sustainability and outcomes. So maybe there's a path to use that model elsewhere in the social infrastructure space.
Thanks, John. There's one question in here from Matt Jensen. I know we're coming up on our time here, so again, if there's, I think we've touched on a lot of the other questions already, but there's a question here from Matt Jensen on the National Infrastructure Bank, and I'll at least just from my point of view, I don't think there's a challenge that there's insufficient capital to finance these projects. I think there's plenty of debt and equity capital looking for a home, and so I don't know that, in my view, there's such a strong need for a national infrastructure bank. We need funding. We need money that can come in upon which we can finance projects, and I don't know that the National Infrastructure Bank would necessarily solve that. But that's just my view. I don't know if any of the other panelists have a view on that.
I would just say my challenge is that we always like to. We want to attract capital, but capital requires return, and it wants to be paid back, and we have to figure out how it's paid back, and the funding is the answer to that. So whether it's all the examples that you and DJ were going through before, I think are entirely valid, and I think it frankly is our area of priority, at least anyway, figuring out sort of what those sources of funding, federal, local, wherever are available. Sorry, DJ, I cut you off.
Oh, no. I was not surprised. We completely agree with you, Frank. By the way, I think Frank is the world's biggest winner from the 2020 election outcome. You now have, you move from administration that was like hostile to anything dealing with New York to Schumer as majority leader. So, and you've got a governance structure that'll be more manageable. I won't let you comment on that. But yeah, kudos to you, Frank, and what you're doing there. I think in terms of an infrastructure bank, I mean, so this came up in the Obama administration. We talk about it as well. The biggest challenge is what problem are you trying to solve, right? Tom, to your point, if you have, there's plenty of equity out there, so maybe some grants might be helpful because it's not really equity; you don't have to pay it back. Low income debt, well, we've got that with TIFIA and WIFIA. Project oversight, you got the Build America Bureau. So I think the biggest concern is that we would create a new entity. And that entity would need to be fed and have processes and procedures and can actually just slow everything down. And we ran into that with Federal Highways. We created an office to try to coordinate everything, and it obviously ended up just slowing everything down. So, and then you look at the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, where literally they spent a year debating where to locate it. My concern in terms of infrastructure bank is it sounds good, and maybe there needs to be some policy benefits because we can streamline some processes, maybe some standardization. But in the long run, it's hard to see that wins a cost benefit analysis.
Looks like we've got time. Thank you for that, DJ. Looks like we have time for one more quick question. Looks like one we haven't touched on is coming in from Brian and Sorry. Hi, Brian. Glad you could join us today. Is the path towards securing social equity run through the overall program management and design services? And how is that playing out in real time for Gateway? And I'll just open it up generally. I think maybe there's more of a just, social equity and infrastructure and, what are we seeing that's different? And, I know we're seeing different parties come in, even equity investment participants coming in that are, minority-owned interests and others, disadvantaged business enterprises that are coming into the market and playing roles throughout the life cycle of the project, from advising early on through construction, through operations maintenance, and lending and equity investing. So I think we're seeing very positive trends in that regard. But open it up to the panelists, and I don't know, Frank, if there's anything specific you can share. It can't wait this time on it, but
just very briefly, I'd say, social equity sort of more broadly, I think is what we're focused on and what we think is one of the strengths of the project, frankly, in terms of, by that I mean, giving my 3 R's, reliability, resiliency, and redundancy, so that people can reliably get to where they need to be in the New York, New Jersey region and on the Northeast Corridor on Amtrak. And importantly, that means people being able to get to their jobs, being able to rely on when they're going to get home again and see their families, and being able to basically be where they need to be when they need to be there. And I think that's that, if you like, that mobility aspect of it is very, very important, and we think is something that why we need to progress our project as quickly as we can.
Great. Well, thank you to the panelists very much. Great to hear your thoughts on all these topics, and thank you to the audience for all your participation and questions. Any questions that didn't get answered, we'll plan to follow up separately with those after the call. We're really running out of time, and I guess with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Damien.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you to DJ, Frank, and John as well. Best minds in infrastructure were on here today, and I really hope that everyone that attended really did get something from this, and please watch out for other sessions that we'll be doing on a range of topics. Just to summarize, 5.6 trillion of potential from an infrastructure perspective in terms of investment requirement. Climate and sustainability, almost in any asset class, but you heard it in droves in this one. And from John, you've got to develop the strong base. I also heard pivoting to new areas as being key, and I think that that's not an easy thing to do. That needs new ideas, it needs new experience, and probably whilst retaining your capabilities in the existing areas. We heard from Frank and John also about the risks, and how do you model the risks? How do you keep focused on the project, the financing, and the actual construction risks that go with it, and I guess the social, environmental risks that are increasing. And then lastly, just on the packaging. I think in summary, what I would say is I heard a lot of heavy lifting by everyone that's involved in this sector. There's obviously a lot of work for everyone to conduct. And just for our own part, I thought I'd just end on the last bit about, for you that may have not heard from Acuity in the past, this is really where we come into our own. When you're busy, when you're trying to have more capacity, when you're trying to move into new areas, or even the areas where you need to free yourself up to do greater and better things, it's how can we assist with some of those tasks at a lower cost of ownership, if you like. So anyone that's been involved in RFP, the kind of work involved there. Anyone that's involved in due diligence or the financial modeling and scenario analysis, again, significant amount of work there. I'll leave it there. You can see it's a broad spectrum of industry expertise. But if you need the help, if you want augmentation to your own organizations, whether it's on a project basis or a permanent basis, we're here to help, and we'd love to be able to tell you how we could help you. So lastly, again, thank you to the panel. Thank you for everyone that attended, and I wish you well and stay safe. Thank you, everybody.